Hey everyone, Tankenstein here. In this guide, I'll be going over what I consider to be the 5 best tank modules to damage and destroy if you cannot outright destroy the enemy tank that you're fighting. This video will be going over the modules that you're most likely to encounter and are readily hittable, so internal modules won't really be discussed too much here, outside of kind of one exception. Now obviously, if you have a side shot against an enemy tank, or a cannon that's powerful enough to reliably one-shot the enemy that you're fighting, you may as well just take that and kill them instantly. This guide is crafted for those many scenarios where the enemy might have too much armor, too powerful of a cannon, or could simply just be too fast. Basically, this guide is for fighting enemies that might be tougher for your individual tank to kill than it would be to destroy other tanks. What I will talk about in this guide will cover the vast majority of tanks and how to destroy their most important modules. So if you can think of a scenario where the general rules of this guide do not apply, then poo on you. There are simply too many tank types and layouts for me to cover 100%, so I've done my best to cover 99% plus of the vehicles and scenarios in War Thunder. With that said though, let's jump into the video. And bear in mind, this list is not necessarily in order of best to worst or worst to best, but rather this is just kind of a conglomeration of the best modules in total, and the best module in any one given scenario will be different from the best module in another scenario. So for number 1, we have the cannon. This one is obvious in that if you destroy the cannon, the enemy can likely no longer damage you. Of course, they may also have HMGs or other secondary weapons that can damage you if you are sufficiently poorly armored, or if they just have numerous weapons, but that's beside the point. If you destroy the cannon, you effectively take away the ability to make war for the vast majority of tanks. If you do this, barring another enemy jumping into your fight, you should be able to immediately go for the kill. By destroying the cannon, you give yourself a lot more time to be able to examine the enemy and also look for weaknesses. Typically, destroying the cannon can be done in a few different ways, such as via primary cannon or through the use of an autocannon to hit the enemy cannon. The latter is typically done by SPAA or a higher BR autocannon carrying vehicle, both of which can typically immediately flank and kill the enemy, as the now cannonless tank will have no way to defend himself. Typically, the best shot will be to be able to hit the end of the cannon, especially if the enemy's cannon has a muzzle brake on it, which provides a nice juicy target for you to hit. Hitting one of these will put the cannon out of commission with ease, though of course shooting any part of the cannon along the midline will typically do the same. Be aware, however, if you tend to hit like the top or the bottom of the cannon, for whatever reason, War Thunder simulates that as not a great shot a lot of the time, so you want to make sure you're either hitting the muzzle brake at the end of the cannon or somewhere dead center in the cannon's midline. For the second shot, and this is kind of similar, but the cannon breach. Now again, this is very similar to the cannon destroying shot, but is a bit tougher to do in some instances, but is oftentimes well worth the effort. The reason why this tends to be the preferable module to damage of the two if you have to choose one or the other, though sometimes you will destroy both the cannon and cannon breach by coincidence, is because being able to damage the breach will oftentimes mean that the internals of the turret are also damaged. From possible ammo rack explosions, crew damage, or damage to other modules like cannon drives, making this shot will typically put the enemy out of commission for a bit longer than a simple cannon destruction. As one might imagine, pulling off such a shot will be a bit more difficult, but is typically easily done with a little bit of knowledge and armor pen. This shot will typically not be as easy with autocannons, so regular full-size cannons will normally do the trick. In order to do this, you'll want to aim just to the right or left of the base of the cannon and then fire. Typically, this area has somewhat soft armor, and along with destroying the cannon breach, you will oftentimes take out crew members. For the most part, if facing an enemy tank, you'll want to shoot the enemy on the right side of the turret, again, your right if you're facing the enemy tank, and you will oftentimes take out a gunner and maybe even a commander, as well as, of course, the cannon breach. Alternatively, you can shoot the side of the turret near the front, and it will typically destroy the cannon breach with ease and also take out the gunner. If doing this, you'll want to aim for the flattest area of armor on the side of the turret, as this will decrease the effective armor on the enemy tank and will also decrease the chance of a ricochet. And for the third module to destroy, this is probably going to be the most common one to destroy: tracks and wheels. This is a different type of hit and can oftentimes be done incidentally by missing a shot that was meant to destroy the enemy, or of course it can be done on purpose. Regardless of how it happens, destroying tracks or wheels will essentially force an enemy to stay put. If you only destroy one track, the enemy tank can still pivot, so be aware of that, especially if they have a disabled horizontal turret drive, so the only way that they can aim at that point is via pivoting. A way to fix this is to destroy the other tank track, making the enemy entirely immobile. Destroying tracks is useful against all types of enemies, though can be especially useful against tanks with strong frontal armor and possibly with a limited turret traverse rate. This means that you can easily flank the enemy when they're immobilized and thus take them out via their weak side armor. Destroying tracks is one of the most accessible and easy things to destroy on an enemy tank and can be done by both air and ground forces. Additionally, tracks are easily destroyable by most HMGs, which means that you can destroy them with many vehicles without needing to use your primary cannon. Heck, sometimes hitting a track or wheel while the enemy is moving will spin the enemy out, which will oftentimes end up with their weak side armor facing you, which is likely to end in a kill against the enemy. Destroying tracks will oftentimes make the enemy extremely vulnerable, especially if they've already lost their cannon. Additionally, by destroying the track of a fleeing tank, you are essentially dooming them. Destroying both tracks, however, again makes the enemy even easier to kill, and if nothing else, will make it so that they have an even longer repair timer, which could help you out in other ways as well. Oftentimes, tracks are the only visible part of the enemy tank, which means that just by shooting one, if it's the only thing visible on that enemy tank, you may now earn an assist where you otherwise wouldn't have had one before. So if you ever just see a little track sticking out from behind a building, you might want to take that shot, because if you destroy it, you could quickly earn yourself a nice assist and thus more RP and SL. Next up, we have kind of two modules, though kind of one at the same time. It's kind of what people would consider to be a power pack nowadays: the engine and transmission. Now, these are incredibly important when it comes to mobility, because without these, you can't even pivot, you can't do anything, you are stuck where you are without the engine and or transmission. Now, these tend to be behind somewhat weak armor, and they tend to be in the rear of the tank. However, when it comes to MBTs, more and more of them are starting to see placement in the front of the vehicle, with vehicles like the Merkava or even some light tanks like the Centauro. Regardless of where these modules are placed, however, on any one given tank, they typically are placed behind fairly weak armor. In the case of American tanks, for example, they are placed in the rear of the vehicle for the most part, which is also where the weakest armor tends to be. Even on the front of the vehicle, let's say with the Panther, for example, how it has a front-mounted transmission, it actually has transmission under very weak lower glacis armor, which is easily pennable. So you do want to make sure that you kind of know where your various power packs are, where your various transmissions and engines are typically, but a good indication of this, at least somewhat good indication of this, is more or less where the exhaust is coming out of. That tends to be, for the most part. Now, this is one of those things where the engine and transmission can easily be hit by both air and ground, and even more so by air. Even if you have 50 cal spraying down on them during a strafing run, you can typically set it on fire or damage or even destroy the engine or transmission pretty easily, because again, the armor protecting it, especially on the roofing of the engine, is very minimal. Now, by hitting the engine, regardless of if it's via strafing runs or simple ground attack, you will oftentimes set the enemy vehicle on fire, and if you time it right, you'll be able to start fires as soon as they're put out, which will eventually exhaust the enemy's firefighting equipment, which could lead to some easy kills, although kills that might take a little bit of time. Probably the best way to go for this is going to be if the enemy is hidden behind cover, but maybe the rear of the vehicle, or even in some instances, again, with certain vehicles like the Merkava or even Centauros or other similar light tanks, if the engine compartment is sticking out from behind cover, you can typically easily destroy it, and as soon as you see them put out that fire, go ahead and shoot them again, and they'll have another fire to put out. Then you go ahead and shoot them again, and they will die. I mean, heck, if nothing else, this also has the same effect as destroying both the tracks on a vehicle or all the wheels on a vehicle, so you can, in theory, also flank an enemy more easily, especially with the fact that by destroying the enemy's engine, you will eventually force them to exhaust their electrical supply, which means that their turret traverse will be a lot slower in most cases, and they'll also lose access to things like thermals if they had it in the first place, or other things as well, like auto tracking against enemy aircraft. So this could be a very, very useful thing, especially if only part of the enemy vehicle is seen, but for the most part, if you can destroy their engine, the enemy tank will be destroyed one way or the other. And then finally, for the fifth on this list, the turret ring. This one is a bit unique, as it is a weak spot present in some tanks, in others it isn't so much of a weak spot. However, for the most part, it does tend to be a pretty big and also easily exploitable weak spot. Additionally, by hitting this, it is very likely to result in substantial damage to the interior of the tank as well, kind of like how a cannon breach hit does, but with even more destruction, being that turret rings tend to be much less armored compared to cannon breaches. Regardless, even if you don't do the extra damage, it locks the enemy turret in place until it's repaired, making it far less likely that the enemy will be able to hit you, as he'll have to pivot his entire vehicle in order to aim. If you destroy a track, you'll make the situation even worse for him, as he'll become substantially less mobile. Now, what tends to be the trick here is if you are looking at the turret and the hull of the vehicle itself, you want to look at the part where the turret and the hull kind of come together. And if there's some little flat area there, that is the turret ring. For the most part, they are somewhat exposed, even to a very small degree. And if you can pinpoint that spot, you can, again, oftentimes shoot right through it and destroy their turret ring, which makes them substantially less likely to actually be able to hit you, because rather than making fine and very easy movements with their tank turret, now they have to move the entire tank, which makes it, again, substantially more difficult to actually hit you, especially at a range. However, this type of shot typically is a lot easier to do when you are at close range, because quite frankly, at long ranges, the turret ring is just such a small area to actually hit that you might not be able to do it so reliably. So at that point, you might want to hit other areas like, again, cannon breach, maybe the transmission, tracks, so on and so forth. Now, with that said, that about does it. Let me know what you guys think about this guide in the comments below. But in summation, the 5 modules that I picked for this guide were the cannon breach, tracks/wheels, engine/transmission or the power pack, and the turret ring. And again, these will all be destroyable in different scenarios, so again, don't just shoot the cannon just because you can. If you have an easy way to destroy the enemy tank, let's say by destroying an ammo rack that's present on the side of the vehicle, do that. Don't just destroy the cannon just because. The various modules and ways to kill them listed in this video were included in the instances where you can't just one-shot the enemy. So these are kind of contingencies in many ways, you know? You don't want to have to destroy the enemy cannon, you don't want to have to destroy their engine or transmission, but if it will help you to get the kill or even the assist, go ahead and do it. By the way, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all on the other side. Take care, everyone.